We should have listened to the locals. The signs were all there, the awkward smiles when we mentioned our hiking plans, the nervous glances exchanged between the bartender and the old men at the gas station. One of them even warned us outright. "Those woods don't like visitors," the bartender had said, wiping a glass with slow, deliberate motions. "They get into your head." But we laughed it off. Creepy stories, we thought. Just the usual folklore to scare out-of-towners. We were used to stuff like that, and it didn't bother us. Not at the time. There were 5 of us. Me, Emma, my boyfriend, Sam, our friends Tyler and Grace, and Noah, who was Tyler's roommate from college. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a way to disconnect from our phones and the stress of city life. No work, no social media, just us and nature. We'd heard about the forest from some hiking forums. Remote, beautiful, with no marked trails. A real adventure. We packed light, tents, food, water, and a map we printed from the internet. Sam said we wouldn't need it. "Just keep the sun on your left and we'll find our way," he joked. I wish I'd argued harder. The trail started off easy enough, winding through tall pines and thick ferns. The forest was beautiful, just like we'd been told. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. It felt like the perfect escape. For the first few hours, we were in high spirits, joking and taking photos. Tyler made fun of Noah for bringing a flask of whiskey, and Grace kept trying to start conversations about horror movies. "What's scarier?" she asked as we hiked deeper into the woods. "Getting chased by something or hearing it call your name?" "Definitely the name thing," Noah said, laughing. "If something knows your name, you're already screwed." We all laughed too. At the time, it seemed funny. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, we had found a spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. We pitched our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, the forest around us grew quiet. Too quiet. The fire crackled softly in the middle of our camp, casting flickering shadows across the trees. The sky above was a deep, starless black, and the forest around us felt vast and endless. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, passing Noah's flask between us, the warmth of the alcohol cutting through the cool night air. Then Emma heard it. It was just a whisper, soft, distant, carried on the breeze from somewhere deep in the forest. But it wasn't the wind. It was her name. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, sitting up and staring into the dark wall of trees. The rest of us glanced at each other, shaking our heads. "Nope," Tyler said, sipping from the flask. "What did you hear?" "I thought..." Emma hesitated, rubbing her arms as if a chill had settled over her. "I thought I heard someone say my name." Sam laughed, giving her a playful nudge. "It's just your imagination. Or maybe it was the whiskey." Emma tried to laugh with him, but her eyes stayed fixed on the forest. "Yeah, maybe." I could see it in her face, though. She didn't believe it. And truth be told, something about the forest felt off to me too. The silence pressed in from all directions, the usual sounds of night. Crickets, rustling leaves, conspicuously absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. Emma sat quietly for the next hour, barely touching her food. I kept glancing at her, waiting for her to say something more about the voice, but she stayed quiet. I think in some way, she knew that saying it out loud would make it real. When the fire burned low, we decided to call it a night. We climbed into our tents, the thin fabric walls doing little to keep out the cold or the unsettling feeling creeping over us. I lay beside Sam, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the forest. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it. A voice. Software. Gentle. Barely audible. "Emma." It came from somewhere just beyond the camp, deep in the forest, as if the trees themselves were speaking. My heart raced as I held my breath, listening for more. But there was nothing. I shook Sam awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "That voice." I swallowed hard. It said my name. Sam sat up, frowning. "Emma, seriously, there's no one out here but us." But there was something in his voice, something cautious, almost as if he was trying to convince himself. "I swear, Sam, I heard it." He sighed, brushing the hair from my face. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you. You're tired, go to sleep, okay?" I nodded reluctantly and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The forest felt alive somehow, aware of us, watching us. And deep down, I knew the voice I'd heard wasn't in my head. The next morning, the forest looked different. I can't explain exactly how, but something about the trees seemed off. They stood taller, closer together, as if they'd shifted overnight. The path we'd taken into the clearing now felt narrower, darker, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. "Weird," Grace muttered as she packed up her gear. "Did the forest feel this creepy yesterday?" Tyler rolled his eyes. "It's just a forest, Grace. You probably watched too many horror movies before we left." But even Tyler seemed uneasy as we packed up camp and prepared to move deeper into the woods. Emma stayed quiet, her eyes scanning the trees nervously. She hadn't mentioned the voice again, but I knew she was still thinking about it. So was I. We hiked deeper into the forest that morning, following what we thought was the same trail from the day before. But the further we walked, the more the trail seemed to vanish beneath our feet. Trees closed in around us, and before long it felt like we were walking in circles. By midday, we were lost. "Did anyone mark the trail?" Grace asked, her voice sharp with panic. "I thought Sam was doing it," Tyler said. "I thought you were." Sam shot back, frustration creeping into his voice. The argument fizzled out quickly as we realized the truth. None of us had marked the trail. And now, we had no idea which way to go. We tried doubling back, but every path we took seemed to loop back to the same clearing. It was like the forest was shifting around us, rearranging itself when we weren't looking. That's when we heard it. Grace. It was soft, distant, just like the voice from the night before. But this time, we all heard it. Grace froze, her face pale. Did you hear that?" We nodded, too stunned to speak. "Hello?" Grace called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" There was no answer. Just the oppressive silence of the woods. And then, suddenly, Grace took a step toward the trees. "Grace, wait!" Emma shouted, grabbing her arm. "What are you doing?" "I heard it," Grace whispered, her eyes wide with a strange kind of desperation. "It sounded like my mom." "Grace, your mom's not out here," Sam said, stepping in front of her. "You know that." But Grace shook her head. "No, it was her. I know it was." Before any of us could stop her, Grace pulled away and sprinted into the forest, her footsteps vanishing into the underbrush. "Grace, wait!" Tyler shouted, chasing after her. But by the time we reached the tree line, she was gone. We searched for hours, calling her name, scouring every path and trail we could find. But there was no sign of Grace. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole. And the worst part? When we called out her name, the forest called it back. At first, it was just an echo, faint and distant. But the more we shouted, the more it started to change. Grace. The voice was soft and playful, just like before. But this time it didn't sound like Grace's mom. It sounded like Grace herself. We called for Grace until our voices grew hoarse, but the forest gave us nothing in return, just the same stillness pressing in from every direction. It was like the trees themselves were absorbing the sound, leaving no trace of her behind. Tyler paced frantically, dragging his hands through his hair. She has to be close. Maybe we missed something. She's gone, Tyler, Emma whispered, her face pale with shock. The forest took her. No, Tyler snapped. She's just lost. We'll find her. But the panic in his eyes betrayed him. We tried to retrace Grace's path, but the undergrowth was thick and every trail looked the same. It was like the forest had rearranged itself in her absence, closing behind her as if she'd never been there at all. And then we saw the tree. It stood deep within the forest, hidden among dense clusters of pine and tangled roots. But it was different from the other trees. Larger, older, and far more sinister. Its bark was twisted and gnarled, scarred by deep grooves that looked almost like carvings. The roots bulged from the ground like the limbs of some buried creature, and strange moss clung to the branches, drooping down like dead skin. It wasn't just old. It felt ancient, as though it had stood there long before humans had ever walked these woods. The air around it was thick, suffocating, as if the tree exhaled a presence of its own. We approached cautiously, the four of us standing at the edge of the clearing, staring up at the colossal trunk. It seemed to stretch endlessly upward, disappearing into the mist. I don't like this, Emma muttered. She clutched Sam's arm, her eyes wide with fear. Tyler ignored her and moved closer. Maybe Grace came this way, he said. But I knew she hadn't. Something about the tree made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It didn't just look out of place. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. Then, I noticed the carvings. Look at this, I whispered, pointing at the strange symbols etched into the bark. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. Twisting, jagged patterns that spiraled across the trunk in uneven lines. Some of the symbols looked like faces, their mouths open in silent screams. What the hell is this? Sam whispered, running his hand along the grooves. It looks old. Really old. Don't touch it, Emma hissed, yanking his hand away. We don't know what it is. The wind stirred, and for the briefest moment I thought I heard something. A faint, distant whisper carried on the breeze, soft as a breath. My name. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice trembling. Sam and Emma exchanged a nervous glance. Tyler squinted at the tree, stepping closer as if drawn to it. It's probably just the wind, he said, though his voice wavered. But I knew it wasn't. The whisper hadn't come from the wind. It had come from the tree. And it wasn't alone. We circled the tree slowly, examining the strange carvings, hoping to find some kind of clue about what happened to Grace. But the closer I looked, the worse the carvings seemed, almost as if the faces in the bark had shifted when I wasn't looking, their expressions twisting in silent torment. Then Noah noticed something. There's something under the roots, he said, kneeling by one of the thick, knotted roots that snaked across the forest floor. We gathered around as he brushed away the leaves and dirt, revealing a dark hollow beneath the tree. It looked like an entrance, a small, jagged opening in the earth, just large enough for someone to crawl through. Grace might have gone in there, Tyler said, already lowering himself to the ground. Don't be an idiot, Emma snapped, grabbing his arm. Why the hell would she go under a tree? Tyler shook her off, his expression hard and desperate. I'm not leaving her out here. He crouched down and peered into the hollow, shining his flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness, the dirt walls lined with roots and strange jagged stones. Something about that tunnel made my stomach churn. The air leaking out of the opening smelled rotten, like decaying leaves, or old, wet bones. Tyler, don't, I whispered. Something isn't right. But Tyler ignored me. He dropped to his knees and started crawling into the hollow. If Grace is in here, I'm bringing her back, he muttered. Tyler, no! Emma shouted, her voice cracking. She lunged forward, trying to grab him, but it was too late. Tyler disappeared into the darkness beneath the roots. We stood there, frozen, staring at the dark entrance where Tyler had vanished. The forest seemed to close in around us, the air thick with tension. I wanted to call after him, but something about the hollow terrified me. It felt alive, like the tree was waiting for something or someone. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Then from deep inside the tunnel, we heard it. A voice. It was soft, distant, but unmistakable. Tyler's voice. Guys, I think I found something. His words were cut off by a strange, garbled noise, half whisper, half growl. Then there was silence. Tyler, Emma shouted, dropping to her knees at the entrance. She shined her flashlight into the tunnel, but the beam disappeared into the darkness. Tyler, answer me. No reply, just the heavy silence of the forest pressing in around us. And then, the whispering started again. It was louder this time, rising from every direction, as if the forest itself was speaking. Our names drifted through the air, soft and mocking, like voices carried from another world. Emma, Noah, and then mine. Sam. Noah cursed under his breath, stepping back from the tree. We need to leave. Now. Emma didn't move. She was still staring into the hollow, tears welling in her eyes. We can't leave him. We have to get Tyler back. We can't help him, I whispered, grabbing her arm. This forest, it isn't normal. We have to go. No, Emma whispered, shaking her head. He's still in there. I heard him. I squeezed her arm tighter. That wasn't him. Emma stared at me, wide-eyed, as if the realization was slowly sinking in. The voice we'd heard. It wasn't Tyler. It was the forest, mimicking him, luring us deeper, just like it had done to Grace. We stood there in the clearing, paralyzed by fear as the forest whispered our names again and again, the voices twisting into distorted echoes. Each time they called, they sounded a little more like someone we knew, a friend, a family member, someone we trusted. Emma. She flinched at the sound of her name, tears brimming in her eyes. I held her arm tighter, terrified she'd do what Grace did, just bolt into the woods and vanish. We need to move, Noah whispered, scanning the tree line with wild eyes. We're not safe here. Where the hell do we go? Sam shot back, panic in his voice. We've been walking in circles all day. The trail out has to be somewhere, Noah said, though I could tell he didn't believe it. None of us did. Emma's voice was barely audible. What about Tyler? I looked at the dark hollow beneath the tree, the gaping, rotten entrance that had swallowed him whole. The whispers were still drifting from the tunnel, soft and insidious, tempting us with the sound of his voice. He was gone, just like Grace. We can't help him, I said quietly. Whatever's down there, it's not Tyler anymore. Emma's face twisted with grief, but she didn't argue. She knew I was right. Noah grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the tree. We have to go now. We didn't wait. With the forest pressing in on us, the three of us plunged deeper into the woods, hoping, praying, that we could find a way out before the forest claimed us all. The deeper we went, the worse things became. The air grew thick with humidity, and the trees pressed closer together, their branches tangling overhead like the bars of a cage. Every step felt harder, as if the ground itself was working against us, roots snagging our feet, bushes pulling at our clothes, and the whispers never stopped. Sam, Noah, Emma. They echoed from every direction, soft and pleading, as if the forest was trying to wear us down. Each time we heard them, they grew harder to ignore, especially when they started sounding like the people we loved. At one point, Noah stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale as a ghost. "What is it?" Emma whispered. Noah didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring into the shadows. "It's my sister," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I heard her. She's calling me." "There's no way," I said firmly, grabbing his arm. "Your sister's not here, Noah." He shook his head, his eyes wide with desperation. "No, you don't understand. It was her. I know her voice." "Noah, listen to me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's not real. The forest is playing tricks on us. That's what it wants. It wants us to follow." For a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to him, but then he yanked his arm free and bolted into the trees. "Noah, don't!" Emma screamed, running after him. I grabbed her, pulling her back before she could follow. "It's too late!" I shouted. "He's gone!" We both stood there, breathless, listening to Noah's footsteps disappear into the forest. They faded quickly, swallowed by the woods, and then there was silence. And just like that, we were down to 2. Emma crumpled to the ground, sobbing. "We're not going to make it, are we?" I knelt beside her, trying to hold it together. "We will," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. "We just have to keep moving." She wiped her eyes and nodded, her face pale with fear. Okay, let's go." We didn't look back, we just ran. We ran through the forest, branches slashing at our faces and grabbing at our clothes. It felt like the trees were alive, shifting, bending, closing in around us with every step. The whispers were relentless now, louder and clearer, calling our names in soft, familiar voices. "Emma, Sam, come here." I could hear my mother's voice, soothing and gentle just beyond the trees. Emma whimpered beside me, her father's voice drifting through the night air, calling her name again and again. We pushed on, lungs burning, hearts pounding, but no matter how far we ran, the forest dragged us deeper into its endless maze. Then, just when it seemed like we'd reached the edge of exhaustion, the path opened into a familiar clearing. And there it was, the ancient tree. Its twisted trunk loomed out of the shadows, gnarled and massive, the strange carvings etched deep into the bark. The roots curled across the forest floor like serpents, waiting to ensnare us. The air around the tree was heavy and suffocating, as if the ground beneath it was breathing. Emma stopped dead in her tracks. "No, we can't be back here." But we were, and then I saw them. At first, they were only shadows, small, hunched figures creeping along the thick roots of the tree. But as they stepped into the moonlight, I saw them for what they really were. The creatures were no more than 3 feet tall, their bodies wiry and grotesque, with thin limbs and gray, leathery skin stretched too tight over their bones. Their heads were too large for their bodies, with sharp, twisted features, elongated mouths filled with jagged teeth, slitted black eyes that gleamed with malice, and long, twitching ears. They moved with a jittery, unnatural grace, crawling along the roots and ground on all fours like hungry insects. One of them grinned at us, its teeth glinting in the moonlight. It opened its mouth, and from its throat came a soft, pitiful whimper. "Help me." It wasn't the creature's voice. It was Grace's. Emma gasped, her face going pale. "Grace?" she whispered. The creature tilted its head, lips curling in a grotesque mockery of a smile. Then it spoke again, perfectly mimicking Grace's voice. "Emma, come closer. Please." Emma took a shaky step forward, but I grabbed her arm, yanking her back. "Don't," I whispered. It's not her. It's them. The gremlins crawled closer, circling us like vultures. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, as if they were puppets controlled by invisible strings. Every now and then, one would stop, tilting its head to the side, listening to something we couldn't hear. And then I understood. "They're feeding it," I whispered, staring at the massive tree. "The tree. This is how it survives." Emma's eyes widened in horror. "It lures people in, and they feed it?" I nodded. "And those things?" I pointed to the gremlins, watching us with their slitted, hungry eyes. "They do the luring." One of the creatures scuttled closer, its voice changing to mimic Emma's father. "Emma, sweetie, I'm waiting for you. Come here." Emma's whole body trembled. I could see her resolve breaking, the whispers burrowing into her mind. The creatures were relentless, imitating every voice she longed to hear. I knew what they wanted. They wanted us to come closer, to step willingly into the grasp of the ancient tree. And once we did, we would never leave. I kept my grip on Emma's arm as the creatures closed in, their sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. One of them crawled onto a thick root, grinning as it whispered again in Grace's voice. "It's okay. Come with me. You'll be safe here." The ground beneath the tree shifted, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, what we were standing on. The roots weren't just roots, they were bones, tangled in the earth, half buried in the dirt. The gremlins had been doing this for a long time. "We need to go," I whispered, my heart hammering in my chest. "Now." Emma didn't respond. She was staring at the creatures, mesmerized by the sound of her father's voice. "Emma!" I shouted, shaking her. "It's not real! Snap out of it!" She blinked, her eyes welling with tears. "But what if it's really him?" "It's not," I said firmly. "You know it's not." The creatures hissed, frustrated by my interference. One of them scuttled up the trunk of the tree, its long claws scraping against the bark. The others followed, circling us like predators waiting for their moment to strike. And then the largest one, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, spoke with a voice that froze my blood. "Sam." It was my mother's voice. I faltered, the words catching in my throat. For a brief moment, I saw her face, not the gremlin's twisted grin, but my mother's soft, familiar smile, just the way I remembered it. The creature leaned closer, its voice almost soothing. "Come home, Sam. I've been waiting for you." My grip on Emma loosened just for a second. "Sam!" Emma shouted, grabbing my arm this time. "Don't listen to it." I snapped out of the creature's spell, my pulse racing. I could feel the forest pressing in around us, the air heavy with malice. The creatures were waiting for us to give in, to take just one step closer to the ancient tree. If we did, we were finished. "Run!" I shouted, yanking Emma with me. We sprinted away from the tree, the creatures screeching in frustration behind us. Their whispers shifted into angry growls, and I could hear them scuttling through the roots, chasing us through the forest. The path ahead twisted and turned, the trees closing in around us, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. The creatures hissed and shrieked from the shadows, their voices warping into screams of pain and rage. I could feel their breath on the back of my neck, their claws scraping at my heels. But we kept running, faster and faster, until the ancient tree disappeared behind us. The whispers faded. The forest began to thin. And then, just as the first light of dawn broke through the canopy, we saw it. A break in the trees. We burst through the edge of the forest, gasping for breath, and collapsed onto the dirt trail beyond. For the first time in what felt like hours, the forest was silent. We had made it out. Hours later, Emma and I found our way to the nearest ranger station, exhausted and delirious. Dirt clung to our clothes, and our skin was streaked with scratches from the forest. We stumbled into the office, collapsing into chairs as two park rangers looked up from their desks, startled. "You kids okay?" one of them asked, already reaching for the phone. "What happened?" I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. Emma beat me to it, her voice cracked and hoarse. We were in the woods. Something's in there. Something dangerous." The rangers exchanged glances, concern flickering across their faces. "Take it easy," one of them said. "You've had a rough night. Just tell us what happened." We told them everything. The whispers, the ancient tree, the creatures that mimicked voices luring people deeper into the forest. We told them about Tyler and Grace and how they'd vanished without a trace. The rangers listened without interrupting, their faces tight with concern. When we finished, one of them stood up slowly, giving us a long, careful look. "Wait here," he said, before disappearing into the back office to make a call. Emma leaned close, her hands trembling. "They don't believe us," she whispered. "They have to," I muttered, though deep down I knew she was right. The ranger returned a few minutes later, this time with a police officer. "You kids went off trail?" the officer asked, his tone measured. "We didn't mean to," I said, frustrated. "The forest." He held up a hand, cutting me off. "Look, we're going to send some folks out to search the area, but there's no ancient tree and no creatures, all right? This forest plays tricks on people who aren't used to it. People get disoriented all the time." I stared at him in disbelief. "We're not making this up. Tyler and Grace. If your friends are still out there, we'll find them," the ranger said, though his voice carried no conviction. Emma buried her face in her hands, shaking with silent sobs. The officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, if it's any comfort, people wander off in these woods all the time. They usually turn up. The forest just messes with your head." But I knew that wasn't true. Tyler and Grace weren't coming back. And the forest, it hadn't just messed with our heads. It had taken something from us. After a few hours of questions and paperwork, they let us go. We walked out of the ranger station into the harsh afternoon sun, too tired to feel relieved. "Do you think they'll really send anyone to look?" Emma asked quietly. I shook my head. "Even if they do, they won't find anything." We stood there for a moment, staring back at the wall of trees in the distance. The forest was still, peaceful, as if none of it had ever happened. Emma grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. "It's over, right?" I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to believe it. But as we turned to leave, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying with it a soft, familiar sound. A whisper. "Sam." I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart lurching in my chest. I turned, staring into the forest, half expecting to see one of those creatures peeking out from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just trees, swaying gently in the breeze. "Sam?" Emma whispered nervously, tugging on my arm. I forced a smile, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, it's over." We walked away from the forest, leaving the ranger station behind us. But the truth was, I knew we'd never really left. Because once the forest knows your name, it never stops calling.